Have you ever looked at someone and thought you knew their whole story, only to realize there was a profound, unseen depth beneath the surface? Imagine an ordinary day at airport security, filled with the usual rush and impersonal routine. But what if, in that sterile environment, a quiet, unassuming act of disrespect unintentionally unveiled a lifetime of extraordinary, untold sacrifice? This is a story about hidden valor, the true meaning of dignity, and how sometimes the loudest stories are carried in the quietest souls, just waiting for the right moment to be seen. In the sterile buzz of the airport security checkpoint, where plastic bins clattered and shoes shuffled along the conveyor, her faded duffel bag was tossed carelessly onto the scanner, treated like yesterday's garbage. The security guards snickered amongst themselves. Passengers whispered, eyeing the elderly woman with cheap souvenirs poking out of her worn bag. But then the X-ray screen flickered to life. It revealed a folded American flag, a military insignia, and a commemoration case stamped with top secret. Suddenly every laugh died in the air. Every whisper ceased, replaced by stunned silence. Because the clearance level displayed on that screen was higher than anyone in that terminal had ever encountered. Margaret Maggie Hughes, at 63 years old, had once served as a military intelligence officer, engaged in countless classified missions over a remarkable 35-year career. Since retiring, she had chosen a quiet life, carefully guarding her past from all but a select few. Her true service record was hidden deep within classified files, locked away behind layers of government clearance levels that most employees would never see. Today, she was on a solemn journey to attend the memorial service of a fallen comrade, one of the silent heroes who had sacrificed everything to protect the nation's most guarded secrets. Her faded bag didn't just carry souvenirs. It held fragments of memory, pieces of the soul of those who had given their lives without fanfare or recognition. At the security line, Maggie quietly waited, avoiding eye contact, as though she wished to vanish into the crowd. She didn't seek acknowledgement, only to complete her passage through unnoticed. But a group of young security agents, spotting an elderly woman with simple clothes and a worn bag, couldn't stifle their chuckles behind the counter. Maggie heard the low jeers, the mocking whispers, and a flicker of sadness passed through her eyes, though she kept her expression unreadable. Next, called a young TSA agent named Derek, barely in his 20s and fresh on the job for 6 months. His experience with elderly travelers was limited to helping with shoes and explaining liquid restrictions. Maggie stepped forward and placed her battered duffel on the conveyor belt, the same bag that had traveled with her to places off any public map, containing equipment that officially didn't exist. "Ma'am, please remove any electronics larger than a cell phone," Derek said automatically, his gaze barely meeting hers. "I don't have any," Maggie replied softly. "Behind the X-ray machine," Jake, Derek's colleague, smirked. "Bet it's all cheap souvenirs," he whispered loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear. A few exchanged amused glances. To them, she was just another elderly tourist, probably lugging postcards and snow globes from gift shops. Maggie held herself steady, lips pressed into a firm line. She gave no outward sign of emotion, though inside a quiet fury burned, a sense of her honor being trampled by ignorance and mockery. Her hand clenched her boarding pass like a lifeline, the only tangible connection to a glorious past that no one seemed to believe anymore. The weight of her journey pressed on her heart. She was traveling to pay tribute to a friend who had died in service, carrying with her the sole physical remnants of missions that had shaped the course of history. "Standard procedure, ma'am," Derek said as the bag slipped into the X-ray machine. "Won't take but a minute." What Derek and his team couldn't grasp was that this faded bag contained decades of sacrifice, classified missions that had prevented global crises, and the quiet courage of heroes who would never be publicly recognized. Inside lay a carefully folded American flag, awarded to her unit after a perilous mission. There was a military insignia few outside the highest echelons of government would recognize. Nestled in a protective case were documents, silent testaments to a life dedicated to the shadows, to secrets kept for the greater good. The bag moved steadily through the X-ray machine, revealing shapes and shadows that most people couldn't even begin to classify. Maggie stood silently by, her posture straight and composed despite her years. She'd long understood that true dignity wasn't something given by others. It came from deep within herself. Nearby, the young TSA agents bantered casually, unaware that they were on the verge of encountering something that would forever alter their perception of the quiet elderly woman before them. Sometimes the most profound stories are hidden in the most unassuming packages. Jake slouched back in his chair, already ready with his joke, before the image had fully appeared on the monitor. "Let me guess," he called out with a smirk. "Knitting supplies and a bunch of hard candies." Derek laughed softly. "Or maybe some cheap plastic keychains from some tourist trap she dragged herself to." The people waiting in line couldn't help but tune in. A sharply dressed businessman shook his head with amused disbelief, while a young couple whispered to each other, casting Maggie furtive looks filled with thinly veiled pity. One of the other security agents chimed in, "Poor old lady probably doesn't even remember what's in that bag." Maggie remained perfectly still, her weathered hands folded calmly in front of her. Each mocking remark stabbed like a needle into her back. But she'd heard the same kind of thing too many times before to react. Instead, she drew on a quiet strength, one born of surviving storms that most people could never imagine. The swell of powerless anger and scorn bubbled beneath the surface, but she forced it down. She could never reveal her true identity. Not here, not now. Her work had been classified at such a high level that her name was still a secret decades later. Behind her, an elderly man shifted uneasily, clearly unsettled by the disrespect, but he kept silent. "Ma'am, could you please step aside for a moment?" Derek's voice cut through the murmurs. Sometimes these old machines take longer to process vintage luggage. More snickers rippled from the security team. Maggie stepped aside gracefully, holding on to her dignity despite the clear insinuation that something about her belongings was suspicious. Jake turned his full attention to the screen, expecting to see the usual harmless items of an elderly traveler. His finger hovered above the all-clear button, ready to wave her through. But then the image fully resolved, and his easy smirk faded. What caught his eye first was the sharply defined triangular shape nestled in the center of the bag. Too precise, too perfectly folded to be a random piece of cloth. The density readings showed heavy fabric layered meticulously in a pattern. "That's a flag," Derek whispered, leaning in closer. "Lots of people travel with flags," Jake responded, but his tone had lost all mockery. Then a second item came into view, a rectangular, dense metallic object with complex internal components that looked official. But it was the third item that froze them both in place. A small rectangular case, made of reinforced material, appeared with an unusual density signature. The machine's software began flashing warning signs over it. Even more striking, faint lettering was visible on the case, reversed through the X-ray, but still legible. "Top secret," Derek read aloud, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. "That can't be right," Jake said, though his hand had already moved away from the all-clear button. As he adjusted the screen's contrast and zoomed in, more details emerged. The case bore additional markings as property of Defense Intelligence, and what looked like a classification code neither of the young agents recognized. The casual, almost playful atmosphere at the checkpoint shifted instantly. Other agents noticed Derek and Jake's sudden, intense focus. "Is that what I think it is?" one of them murmured, the joking fading fast. Maria, a senior agent with 15 years under her belt, leaned closer to the monitor and scanned the image. Her eyes widened slightly, and without hesitation, she reached for the phone. "I need to escalate this immediately," she said in a low voice. Nearby, a businessman waiting in line glanced at his watch, clearly growing impatient. "What's the delay?" "It's just one bag," he muttered, but the atmosphere around the security checkpoint had already shifted. Derek and Jake exchanged uneasy looks. The elderly woman they had quietly mocked moments before now seemed far more complex than they had assumed. "Ma'am," Derek said, his tone now markedly more respectful as he addressed Maggie, "we need to conduct a manual inspection of your bag. This is routine for certain items." Maggie nodded, calm and composed, as though she had anticipated this moment from the start. Within minutes, a supervisor arrived, followed swiftly by another official. Quiet conversations and urgent phone calls filled the air, and the tension at the checkpoint thickened palpably. Other passengers took notice. The earlier dismissive whispers gave way to hushed curiosity. The once overlooked elderly woman had become the focus of intense scrutiny. Jake stared at the X-ray screen, his earlier confidence now completely gone. The folded flag, the classified case marked with official seals. Nothing here fit the image of a harmless tourist. "Sir," he asked his supervisor, voice shaking slightly, "do we have something?" The supervisor's gaze fixed on the monitor, and the weight of the situation settled over him immediately. The checkpoint, previously alive with casual chatter, fell into a sudden, heavy silence. All eyes turned toward Maggie, who stood with quiet dignity. What had seemed like mere stubbornness now felt like the composure of someone who had faced far graver matters than airport security. In that charged moment, the arrogance of assumption collided with the chilling reality of undeniable truth. The X-ray revealed more than objects. It unveiled a lifetime of hidden courage and sacrifice. Frank Morrison, a stern supervisor with 25 years of experience, approached the monitor, his concern deepening. He had encountered all sorts of unusual items during his career, but classified military materials were entirely beyond his usual realm. "Clear the area," Morrison ordered softly. "I need to make some calls." Maggie was escorted to a private, windowless screening room, the space feeling more like an interrogation chamber than a security checkpoint. Morrison's tone remained professional but cautious. "Ma'am, I will need to personally inspect your bag," he said. "These look like restricted materials." "I understand," Maggie replied with quiet authority, a tone that seemed oddly familiar to Morrison, though he couldn't place why. As Morrison carefully unzipped the worn duffel, his hands moved with the reverence one reserves for fragile historical artifacts. The first item he pulled out was a meticulously folded American flag, its military folds still perfect despite the years and travels. "This flag was presented to my unit," Maggie said simply, watching Morrison handle it with care, "after a particularly difficult operation." Morrison nodded solemnly, setting the flag aside with evident respect. Next came a tarnished military insignia, giant but unmistakably official. While the exact unit eluded his memory, its significance was clear. But it was the third item that stopped him cold. A small metal case stamped with multiple classification markings Morrison had never encountered outside of top-secret files. The classified documents she carried were the property of the Defense Intelligence Agency, strictly eyes only, requiring a security clearance so high that her hands trembled ever so slightly as she carefully photographed them using the security camera. Frank Morrison, the TSA supervisor, eyed the situation with growing concern. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to verify some information," Morrison said, pulling out his secure phone. His voice carried the weight of uncertainty. This is way beyond my clearance level." Within minutes, Morrison was connected to a duty officer at the Department of Defense. The conversation on the other end was brief but utterly transformative. "Sir, I have a Margaret Hughes here with classified DIA materials," Morrison reported cautiously. A long, tense pause followed. "Can you repeat that name?" The voice over the secure line was sharp, suspicious. "Margaret Hughes," Morrison repeated. "She appears to be traveling with classified materials." "But stop right there," the voice cut in firmly. "Do not discuss this over an open line. I'm sending someone immediately. Treat Ms. Hughes with the highest respect and provide any assistance she requires." Morrison's face paled as he ended the call. He turned toward Maggie, no longer seeing her as just an elderly traveler raising a flag, but as someone whose very presence had triggered high-level government protocols. "Ms. Hughes," Morrison said, his entire demeanor shifting into one of profound respect, "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. I've been instructed to provide you with every courtesy." Maggie simply nodded as if she had expected this outcome all along. There was something calm and steady in her gaze, a quiet confidence born of years of service. Word of the situation spread swiftly through the airport's security network. Within 30 minutes, two men in dark suits arrived, their credentials clearly marking them as federal agents. They exchanged brief words with Morrison, carefully examined Maggie's materials, then used databases that required clearances even Morrison hadn't imagined existed to confirm her identity. "Ms. Hughes," one of the agents said with deference, "your service record indicates you're authorized to transport these materials. We apologize for the delay." Back at the main security checkpoint, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Derek and Jake, who had been joking less than an hour earlier about the grandma's souvenirs, now stood silently, a heavy weight of confusion and respect settling between them. "I don't understand," Derek whispered to Jake. "Who is she really?" Maria, the senior TSA agent, had been quietly making her own inquiries. "From what I've gathered," she said softly, "Margaret Hughes was a high-level military intelligence officer, the kind of person whose missions never show up on any public records." Jake felt a sudden, sickening twist in his stomach. "We mocked her," he murmured. "We called her a confused old lady." Maria's voice was sober, tinged with admiration. "She's probably prevented more threats to national security than all of us will see in our entire careers." When Maggie finally emerged from the private screening room, her belongings properly secured and her documentation thoroughly verified, the reception waiting for her was entirely different. The security personnel who had snickered earlier now stood at respectful attention. Morrison personally escorted her through the checkpoint. "Ms. Hughes, again, I cannot apologize enough for our initial response. Your service to this country is invaluable." Maggie's voice was gentle but firm as she replied, "I'm not here for recognition. I'm just trying to honor the memory of those who never made it home." News of Maggie's true identity began to spread quietly through the airport, not through idle gossip, but via the respectful whispers of those who understood they had been in the presence of someone extraordinary. Several elderly passengers, some likely veterans themselves, approached Maggie with quiet nods of acknowledgement and respect. They didn't need to know the specifics of her service to grasp the significance of the moment. One older gentleman wearing a worn Vietnam veteran cap simply raised his hand and saluted as she passed. Maggie returned the gesture with the practiced precision of someone who had unquestionably earned the right to such honor. Derek approached her hesitantly, his earlier amusement replaced by a newfound reverence. She was preparing to move toward her gate when Derek stepped forward, his voice earnest and tinged with regret. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for how we acted earlier. We didn't realize." Maggie looked up at him, seeing in his eyes a genuine remorse, the kind that comes from someone who has just learned a valuable lesson. "You didn't know," she said softly, "because that's how it was meant to be. But maybe next time remember that every person carries stories you can't see." Jake, standing beside Derek, blushed with embarrassment, his head slightly bowed. "Ms. Hughes, is there anything we can do to make this right?" Derek asked, hopeful. "Treat the next elderly person who comes through here with the same respect you'd give your own grandmother," Maggie replied quietly, her voice steady. "You never know what kind of hero might be carrying memories tucked away in an old worn bag." As she walked away, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, the entire checkpoint fell into a respectful silence. The laughter and mockery from just an hour before had vanished, replaced by a deep understanding of dignity, service, and the quiet heroism walking among them, unseen and unrecognized. Behind her, the federal agents who had confirmed her credentials lingered, speaking in low voices with Supervisor Morrison about protocols and how to handle such situations in the future. Morrison asked one agent, "What exactly did Ms. Hughes do during her service?" The agent glanced once more at Maggie's retreating figure before answering. "Some stories are too important to tell and too classified to share. But the fact that she's trusted to travel freely with those materials says everything you need to know about her clearance level and the faith this country places in her." The airport, which had dismissed her as irrelevant only an hour earlier, now recognized her as a living piece of American history, someone carrying memories and honors far beyond ordinary understanding, deserving of respect. 2 hours later, Maggie arrived at the memorial service for her fallen comrade. The small chapel on the military base was filled with people who looked like ordinary civilians, but carried the unmistakable posture of former intelligence officers. Here she was among her own kind, faces missing from official records, souls who had spent decades guarding secrets that could never be publicly acknowledged. They embraced warmly, exchanging knowing glances full of respect. Though forgotten by official documents, they had never been lost to each other. "Maggie," came a soft whisper from Colonel Sarah Chen, retired from a unit that officially never existed. "I heard what happened at the airport. Word travels fast in our community." Maggie smiled faintly. "That young security guard called his supervisor, who called his supervisor, who eventually reached someone who knew someone," she replied. Chen nodded. "The way you handled yourself, It's already becoming a legend in certain circles. The memorial service was simple but deeply meaningful. Veterans who had sacrificed silently gathered to honor one of their own, someone who had given everything for missions that would never appear in the headlines. During the ceremony, Maggie carefully unfolded the flag she had carried in her worn duffel bag. It was the flag presented to their unit after Operation Silent Shield, a mission that had averted an international crisis but remained classified to this day. As she laid the flag gently on the memorial table beside photos and mementos from others, the room fell into a respectful silence. Afterward, several younger veterans approached Maggie, having heard about the airport incident through military networks. They wanted to express their gratitude. Ma'am, one young woman said, recently retired from the intelligence community, what you did today reminded a lot of us that our sacrifices still matter, even when no one knows about them. Maggie looked at her, voice calm but resolute. Dignity doesn't require recognition. Back at the airport, the incident had sent ripples far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Margaret Hughes' story stretched far beyond the confines of the airport security checkpoint. Derek and Jake, the TSA agents involved, had taken the incident deeply to heart. They requested additional training focused specifically on recognizing and honoring veterans. Not only that, but they also volunteered to participate in programs aimed at helping veterans navigate airport security with the dignity they deserved. Frank Morrison, their supervisor, implemented new protocols designed to handle situations involving classified materials and veteran credentials more thoughtfully and respectfully. The casual disregard and occasional disrespect that had once marked their treatment of elderly passengers was replaced with genuine professionalism and courtesy. During one of their shift briefings, Morrison addressed his team firmly. We treat every passenger with the same respect we'd want for our own family members. You never know who might be carrying more weight than you realize. Maria, the senior TSA agent, took it upon herself to dig deeper into Margaret Hughes's publicly available service record. Although most details remained classified, she learned enough to appreciate that they had been in the presence of someone who had profoundly shaped modern intelligence operations. Maria shared with her colleagues she likely saved thousands of lives, and here we were making jokes about her luggage. Word of the incident began circulating quietly through veteran communities and military families. Not as gossip, but as a sober reminder of the countless silent heroes living among them, carrying the burden of service with humility. A local veterans organization reached out to Maggie, inviting her to speak with young service members about the importance of continuing to serve even after active duty ends. Maggie told them plainly, some of the most important battles are fought in silence by those who choose to serve without seeking recognition or glory. The very airport that had once dismissed her as irrelevant had become a case study, a symbol of how institutions could learn to respect the invisible sacrifices made by those who served in classified roles. Maggie returned to her quiet life, unchanged outwardly, but now connected to a small network of people who understood that true heroes often traveled unnoticed, dressed in worn clothing, carrying faded bags, asking for nothing while deserving everything. 3 months later, Margaret Hughes returned to the same airport for another trip. This time, everything was different. As she approached the security checkpoint, Derek spotted her immediately. He straightened his posture, adopting a respectful and professional demeanor. Good morning, Miss Hughes, he greeted her warmly. How can we assist you today? Just the standard screening, Maggie replied, noticing the genuine change in tone. Jake, now proudly wearing a small veteran support pin on his uniform, handled her bag with obvious care and respect. The casual indifference from months before was replaced by a sincere understanding for what it meant to serve. Ma'am, Jake said quietly as her bag passed through the scanner, your story has inspired us to serve other veterans better. We've undergone training on recognizing and honoring military service. Maggie nodded with approval. That's good to hear. Everyone deserves dignity, whether they're carrying classified materials or simply going home to see their family. The X-ray screen revealed the folded flag, the military insignia, and the classified case once again. But this time, instead of mockery, there was reverence. The security team processed her belongings with the careful attention they truly deserved. Other passengers in line noticed the difference. The elderly man wearing a World War II veteran cap smiled knowingly, and a young mother quietly pointed to her children the special respect the officers showed to this distinguished woman. The ripple effect of that first encounter had extended far beyond this single airport. The story became part of training programs at security checkpoints nationwide. Derek and Jake transformed into advocates for treating all elderly passengers with dignity. Understanding the importance of appearances and respect, Morrison earned a promotion, largely because of how he managed the incident and the improvements he introduced for veteran services at the airport. The protocols he developed were being implemented across the country. Yet perhaps the most profound change was the growing awareness that heroism took many forms. The loud, visible acts of courage were easy to spot and celebrate, but the quiet, unseen service, the classified sacrifices, and the selfless protectors who never sought credit, these too deserved acknowledgement. In a world obsessed with instant fame and public accolades, it was easy to forget that the deepest stories often unfolded in silence, carried in worn bags, reflected in the quiet dignity of those who served when no one was watching. Margaret Hughes never sought applause or public recognition. What mattered to her was that people understood a warrior's true worth wasn't measured by honors or fame, but by their willingness to sacrifice for others, even when those sacrifices would never be known or acknowledged. When she left the airport that day, her bag was still faded, her clothes remained simple, but the honor she bore was finally recognized, not just by the items she carried, but by the respect reflected in the eyes of those who had come to understand. Some heroes wear uniforms. Others carry their service quietly, asking for nothing while deserving everything.